BSL Talks, working for an Australia free of poverty.
Welcome to BSL Talks. I'm Dina Bowman, Principal Research Fellow, Work and Economic Security in the Social Policy and Research Centre at the Brotherhood of St Laurence. In the lead up to International Women's Day, it's wonderful to have so many of you here to join us in this discussion about women, poverty and progress, or lack of progress, as the case may be. I'm joining you from Wadawurrung country in regional Victoria, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands and waterways and pay respect to the elders past and present, and extend that respect to First Nations people joining us today. And when I think about acknowledging country, I also think about the enormous courage of First Nations peoples in resisting and surviving the harms of colonisation and dispossession, including policies that actively work to impoverish First Nations people and their communities. I'm looking forward to a lively discussion. If you'd like to ask questions, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. We have closed captions available. And thank you to Helen, who is the captioner. You just click on the CC at the bottom of the screen. And thanks also to those who are Auslan interpreters. We have Michelle and Jacinta joining us today. And thanks to all those who submitted questions in advance, and we'll try to answer as many as we can. And so this discussion is being recorded and will be made available on the BSL website in the coming week. So 2025 marks the 50th anniversary of the release of the first report of the Commission of Inquiry into Poverty. It was led by Professor Ronald Henderson, and the inquiry shone a light on poverty in Australia and informed the development of the Henderson poverty line. Importantly, the Commission recognised that poverty, and here I quote, arises out of the organisation of society. 1975 was also the United Nations International Women's Year. And as Marion Sawyer notes in a recent Conversation article, Australia has made significant progress towards greater gender equity. And I quote again, as she says, making up some lost ground in areas such as paid parental leave, work value in the care economy, and recognition of the ways economic policy affects women differently from men. However, all of this remains precarious, with issues of gender equality too readily rejected as part of the woke agenda, as she says. The official theme for International Women's Day is for all women and girls, rights, equality and empowerment. This year's theme calls for action that can unlock equal rights, power and opportunities for all, and a feminist future so that no one is left behind. So it's timely to look back, reflect on progress and suggest some ways forward. And we're lucky to have an expert panel to do just that. Joining us today is Prof Bettina Cass, who is Professor Emeritus at the University of New South Wales. She's an elected Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia, and in 1989 was awarded the Order of Australia for services to welfare policy. She's well known to many of you, particularly in relation to the Social Security Review in the 1980s, which she directed. We're also joined by Farah Farouque, who is the CEO of the Victorian Ethnic Communities Council. Prior to joining the Ethnic Communities Council, she was Director of Community Engagement at Tenants Victoria, and prior to that, Principal Advisor for Public Affairs and Policy at the Brotherhood of St Laurence. She was journalist at The Age newspaper for some 20 years where she undertook various reporting assignments across Asia and was political reporter in both Victorian and Australian parliamentary press galleries, as well as social affairs editor and law and justice editor. And finally, last but certainly not least, Professor Kay Cook is the Associate Dean of Research in the School of Science, Social Sciences, Media, Film and Education at Swinburne University of Technology. Her research explores how new and developing social policies such as welfare to work, child support and childcare policies transform relationships between individuals, families and the state. So I'm sure you'll agree we have a fantastic panel to discuss some of the issues and reflect on the past and how we can go forward in the future. So first, I'd like to ask each of you to reflect on progress in tackling poverty over the past 5 decades and consider what has helped to improve women's economic security. Bettina, perhaps I'll turn to you first.
Thank you, Dina. It's a great privilege and honour to be part of this marvellous panel for the Brotherhood of St Laurence for International Women's Day. Where I sit is the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I honour their elders, their leaders, and the current members of their community, and particularly those of First Nations background who are part of our webinar. I'd like to begin fairly, I think, nuts and bolts. Following on from the 1975 First Poverty Commission report and reading all the other work that has come out using poverty lines based on either their line or others, like OECD work, it is quite clear that it's women's increased labour force participation that has been the most important safeguard against falling into poverty. The move away from the male breadwinner model of men's participation and women's involvement in family and the palpable, evident increased labour force participation of women has been absolutely crucial. However, we know, and we'll address it later, that women's participation is still lower than men's participation when they have responsibility for children and for other care for other family members. Women are also still much more likely to work part-time or in casual occupations, in casual positions. And these are often not about flexibility, but they can be precarious. And this is a crucial issue. So when we think about the protection of increased labour force participation, we must always think about, are these decent jobs? And of course, as this was happening, the women falling behind were very often First Nations women and very often women of non-English speaking background whose precarious employment has been well documented but must continue to be addressed. The other tremendously important area was increased public policy emphasis on childcare, the availability of childcare, the costs of childcare, but we still, although we have reports from the ACCC and the Productivity Commission, which seem to have led to a more affordable childcare policy, there are still considerable childcare deserts, particularly in remote and regional areas, which affect children of First Nations families and can also affect people of non-English speaking background and low-income women in particular. So that's a crucial issue. Flexible work practices have mattered enormously over this period, but they must be job protected in decent jobs. There were also, of course, much more recently, as Marion Saw said, job-protected leave, paid parental leave, but we're still an outlier at 26 weeks in the amongst comparable countries, and a real laggard, almost invisible, the job depredations which happen for women with other caring responsibilities, caring through life. Also, the introduction of the family payments package in the late 1980s during the time of the Hawke government reduced women's poverty, reduced children's poverty considerably, but unfortunately there has been diminishment in the value, the true value, the real value of those payments, and greater targeting so that they middle-income families, middle-income women are missing out, and that means children are missing out, and a lower level of indexation. And then there was a huge emphasis over these 50 years, terribly important, on women's education and training, so that women went from being underrepresented in both VET training, where they still are, and in higher education. But the push has been extremely important there. But we know that what also happens is the job segregation of occupations and industries, so that if women continue to be overrepresented in the lowest paid sectors of the workforce, what has in fact been so important in protecting against poverty needs to be addressed further with looking at incomes, with wages, but we'll talk about that later. And then there was so important for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women and their children, there was developed the Closing the Gap for First Nations in a range of spheres, but we know that progress has been much slower than we would like. Now, there's been significantly increased emphasis on education and training for disadvantaged young people and those attempting to enter or re-enter the labour force after caring responsibilities. So this great development that we had also during the period of the Hawke government was the Jobs, Education and Training package for sole parents who are amongst the poorest of women. But that, unfortunately, was also changed, removed, diminished. We can maybe talk about how important such a program is. And then so important, so terribly invisible is the nature of our housing policy, because most poverty, the best indicators of poverty, in my view, after housing costs indicators of poverty. And that terrific bastion of post-war Australia's public policy was that we did have a social housing policy, although unfortunately it was always residual, and it has become even more residual. And that is crucial for women, especially sole parent-headed families headed by women, and especially older women in private rental housing, who I would say are virtually invisible, except for the recent Grattan report. All in all, I would be emphasising full employment and asking the Reserve Bank to say full employment is every bit as important as reducing inflation.
A very comprehensive response, Bettina, which I think covered many of much of the progress that has been made, but also hinted at some of the challenges. So perhaps Kay and Farah, is there anything that you'd like to add to Bettina's response?
Well, I want to acknowledge all those structural changes, obviously, that Bettina has talked about. And, you know, they are triumphs, aren't they? But then we reflect on how much more we have to go. So it's like 2 steps, maybe 3, 4, 5 steps forward and, you know, steps back. And the cultural moment is very speaking to that. Look, you know, education has been an incredible, force and a driver, but we haven't seen that converted into the participation rates or the wages in quite the same way. We still have an overrepresentation of women in the lower paid jobs and in insecure work and indeed in the modern manifestation, the gig economy. And I just want to bring my lens as a CEO of the Ethnic Communities Council of Victoria and talk about women, diverse women from culturally diverse backgrounds, migrant women, refugee women. And we know, for example, that refugee women are less likely to be employed than other women, migrant and refugee women. So there are all these subsets. So I also, in a sense, acknowledge that our conversation has become more nuanced. And whilst I don't, as a former journalist, I don't love that word intersectionality. It is part of the current rhetoric, and I welcome that. So there's a cultural progress piece that sort of aligns with the structural wins as well. But looking into the future, there's so much more to do. We have to keep rattling the cage. And finally, it was remiss of me not to mention that I'm on Wurundjeri land. And of course, all these issues, are refracted through the experiences of First Nations women. Thank you.
Thanks, Farah. Kay, is there anything that you'd like to add with perhaps a particular focus on your work on child support?
Yeah, I don't know. Thanks, Dina. And I'm also on the lands of the Wurundjeri people. Thanks, Farah, for setting that up as well. And thanks to Bettina, that I think you may have left that off to give me something to talk to in your very comprehensive coverage.
I did, yes.
You set them up, I'll knock them down. I was thinking, oh gosh, what am I going to add to this? I think taking that life course perspective really shines a light on where there's still so far to go. That yes, women are entering employment more, yes, incomes are improving, there's paid parental leave, childcare, but when underneath all of this are issues such as, say, family violence, there's parental separation, and that's when things really go south. That's when our system that might work okay in sort of nuclear families, and it then really falls apart, and women are the ones that really bear the brunt of that when they're increasingly expected to be workers, and that can work quite well when there's capacity for that care work to still carry on. But especially as single parents, when the care work has to be prioritised, and particularly in instances of family violence where single mothers in particular are having to support their children through that as well as recover themselves, and as well as now we're increasingly expecting them to be workers first, that's where none of this works anymore. And so things like the childcare scheme, very laudable aims, like it was this amazing piece of feminist policy of how it was brought in, but it's those intersections with family payments that erode the value of those family payments, that it individualizes the transaction and the risk that recipient parents face of it has been completely absent of a family violence overlay. And so all of these things together really make women particularly vulnerable post-separation. And child support doesn't work for families that don't have this middle class, often very European, this Anglo model of a nuclear family. So for Indigenous families, and there's research from the Pacific and in New Zealand that these family structures and the cultural meanings of money and the appropriateness of these individual transfers don't work. And so all of this needs to be more nuanced and to put care first, rather than care is always the add-on of it can be outsourced, it can be invisibilized, but I think we need to move to putting that as the center of what we're doing in social policy.
Absolutely, Kay. I was going to ask you about challenges, but you've kind of, as you say, Kay, it's been like steps forward and then back. So you can't really talk about progress without the challenges and the barriers across time. So I think perhaps maybe we can turn and think about the future and what's needed, if you think in the short, medium and longer term, to progress things and really tackle poverty for everyone, but in this case, particularly for women. And maybe, Farah, would you like to respond first?
Thanks, Dina. Well, I was just reflecting on the fact that, we've had legislative change, and we have, I think despite the wins during the Hawke era, was there one or two women at the cabinet table at various times? So we certainly have a much, more women at the table. The question is, are they being heard? And and this goes across the board at all the policy tables, in the sense that we so that we have there's more structural change afoot, and but we also need the accompanying cultural and political change, and so that's a very complex matrix. But I think it's all about pushing forward, raising our voices. One of the first things one of the former head of the Brotherhood of St Laurence said when I moved from journalism to to work at the Brotherhood of St Laurence, my first sort of social policy job. He said to me, "I've got to explain something to you, Farah. Change in this country is deeply incremental." And I was sort of, coming from a journalistic background, where you think the next headline is going to produce the requisite social change within the week and the response, and perhaps in the social media change era, sometimes that does happen. But I was sort of disappointed. Where's the ambition? But actually, I've learned over time that the ambition is in the long slog, the work, the essential research work that Bettina and Kay are conducting. The advocacy work organisations like the Ethnic Communities Council of Victoria conduct alongside many of our social sector colleagues. But I have to say, progress is damningly slow. So I think it's about being in those trenches of social change and plugging away and working on the cultural changes as well. And that includes, from the perspective that I come from, representation also matters, and therefore we need to see migrant and refugee background women of color also have an equal place at the table, and unfortunately we're not there yet. But I think to be in the social change advocacy business, you've got to be an optimist. So I encourage everyone to be optimistic and do what you can in this sphere of influence you're in, which includes participating in forums like this ahead of International Women's Day. But it's no easy task. I hope I'm not being too negative.
What are your thoughts, Bettina?
Well, I'm saying this deliberately, Dina. You said you wanted us to look at tackling poverty for women in the short, medium and long term. I don't think we can differentiate that, as I'm sure you don't. And I think that it's the long haul, it's the long term, and we should be setting that out. And at the risk of, I'm not plagiarising, I am going back to a not very long ago report that came from the Women's Economic Equity Taskforce that 2023 to 33, which was chaired by Sam Mostyn, who is now our Governor-General. And that really sets out, I think, a fabulous long-term agenda. And the Minister for Women, Katie Gallagher, has in fact endorsed it. So it's really quite crucial that we don't forget these important pieces of work that have been done and which should be feeding in to our conversation. So I'm going to go very quickly through their 7-point plan, like really quickly. Their first recommendation is the Australian government must provide leadership and accountability to driving economic equality outcomes. I'm not talking about poverty because, as we all know, we can't talk about poverty without talking about inequality. So what this task force is saying, WHEAT for short, the WHEAT task force, provide leadership and accountability for driving economic equality outcomes and embed gender equity into its decision-making and its budgeting and its policy design. And therefore, when we talk about, for instance, I take one policy that I think could be immediate, that is work on increasing the 26 weeks of paid parental leave to 52, which is a benchmark for other similar countries. It's because we're thinking about the long term through women's life course. And when we talk about government investment, public sector investment in areas of childcare deserts, when all the talk about how to do childcare for, I don't know, 5 decades has been about the privatisation and marketisation. What our big reports now are saying, ACCC Productivity Commission, they're saying government investment. Goodness me, how long did we have to get for those words to come up on the policy agenda? The next recommendation is I've already said it, investing in policies and programs. That is, the government must invest in policies and programs which recognise the importance and the value of care work. And this is what Kay was saying, both paid care work and care work in families and extended families, because the impact on women and children, men, particularly women, over the life course of their unpaid care work and their paid care work can, in fact, after a whole lifetime of contribution, I'm going to tear up, can actually impoverish them. So in old age, they can be living alone, having been sometimes victims of family violence, not always, but sometimes, in rental housing, without a decent bulwark of good housing policy underneath them, no savings, and left behind in our retirement income system. So that's their second recommendation. The third is government should be utilising its legislative, regulatory and spending powers to ensure that all Australian workplaces create safe, secure, flexible and equitable work opportunities that support women's economic participation. So as we know, and I'm sure Farah would agree from the point of view of refugee women and non-English speaking, called women, and Kay would know from women affected by family violence, can also be affected by harassment at work. So it's not only about full employment and equal employment participation, it's about the decency of jobs and whether government goes all out to protect them. And the fourth recommendation is that the Australian government should provide women with lifelong, accessible, flexible and affordable education and skill building. And I think that that's so crucial for disadvantaged groups, and we know who they are. First Nations women, women of core background, poor women from backgrounds that haven't enabled them to slot easily into good educational opportunities. And so importantly, women moving out of caring situations, no longer having children, young children to care for and wanting to re-enter the workforce. Women no longer having other caregiving responsibilities. Women and all others moving out of illness episodes, physical and mental illness episodes. How do we provide the jobs, the opportunity, the training that are going to enable them to participate in decent work? And their fifth recommendation is to undertake a long-term, targeted and deliberate investment program to ensure that women are leading and building the economy in equal measure to men. I think Farah was saying that. I would go further. I would say not only building the economy, but building the community. In other words, those leadership roles which are so absolutely critical in bringing a gendered lens and a feminist lens into that process. And their sixth recommendation is the government must ensure that women have financial security across their lives. My colleague Deb Brennan and I have been, because we worked together for a long time, have said for so long that there's excellent emphasis on childcare, but as women grow older, they're suddenly really invisible. And older women in the retirement income system, until very recently, it wasn't even seen as a priority. Women in private rental housing living alone from the age of, say, 55 onwards, they're invisible. So that what is absolutely required is a whole lifetime story of income opportunity and the opportunity to acquire the assets and the retirement incomes necessary to live a decent and dignified life. And their final recommendation is that the Australian government must invest in programs to address community attitudes and bias that prevent women's full economic participation across a lifetime. I know that's huge. I had a great mentor in public policy who firmly believed this. He worked in the period of the Whitlam Government when I like to think I was still a child. I wasn't, of course, but that you don't just push along with attitudinal change when you've done the research and you know that a policy is a strong one, introduce it. And it will bring the attitudinal change with it. I still believe in that. I still believe if we know that violence and harassment are terrible, both in private settings and in work settings, we have to work on changing attitudes, but we've also got to ensure that the legislation is there and the protections are there, and that itself changes attitudes. I've finished.
Thanks, Bettina. Again, wonderfully comprehensive. Kay, you're a member of the Economic Inclusion Advisory Committee, and many of the recommendations that have been made, I suppose, can echo recommendations that have been made elsewhere, for example, in the Wheat report that Bettina was referring to. And if you look across time, one could say that actually we know what is required to support women's economic security and address poverty. So what do you think is getting in the way, and how can we tackle whatever it is that it's getting in the way?
What could it be? I don't put my finger on it. And it's part of what Farah was saying, and obviously what Bettina was saying, that all of these programs, policies and recommendations are about getting women to do more and be more equal. the Hilda report data that was on the news this morning was saying men are still doing the same amount of housework as they were 20 years ago. That it's women that we're seeing in all of this conversation that are experiencing the burdens and the penalties of care work. Why don't we distribute those burdens across more people? That might be a better way to go. But what's the incentive to do that? That they're burdens, they come with penalties over the life course. So in things like paid parental leave, and this is me going off script, that we have, like, here we have a really gendered paid parental leave. Other countries you have blocks of care. You get 3 months, you get 3 months. That's not how care works in life. One parent, it sets up the one parent carer, one worker. Why don't we do things? And this is where people might sort of start switching off or unsubscribe. Why don't we set up, after an intense period of care, we make it part-time care for both? Both parents are off 4 days a week. Then both parents are off 3 days a week. Then both parents are off 2 days a week to manage this transition into paid, the formalised childcare or other forms of informal care. And both parents have that role in participating and taking responsibility for day-to-day care together. That it's not one person, that you're the primary carer and I just do the tasks that you assign me. Why don't we structure it how we actually live it, rather than thinking there's going to be some magic transformation after women go back to work that's going to magically change the cultural. That's my off-script moment. The other thing that really needs to change in that it's where culture meets administration, that we design these systems and we build them for the people they work that need them least, but that they are most able to access these systems. So if we look at things like who's accessing even income support payments, who's accessing child support, for example, the very recent questions on notice and Senate estimates that showing that it's First Nations women who are not passing the maintenance action test, that are not signing up for child support, so they're having their family tax benefits reduced to the minimum. Because these systems don't work for them, they don't resonate with them, they're not built for them. And that's what Farah was saying. We need this diversity around the table as we're designing policies, as we're designing implementation. These systems have to work most for the people who need them the most, not the people who are middle-class bureaucrats in Canberra that think this is a genius system of how to organise Services Australia, where it doesn't work for refugee women, for non-English speaking women, Indigenous women, women with disabilities. How we need those people around the table telling us exactly how this works and needs to work.
Thanks, Kay. A lovely segue. I'm turning to questions from the audience. We invited questions when people registered, and we've got a lot, and we've also got some that are coming in live. But there's a question here that asks, that says, I'd love Farah's thoughts on the growing backlash against diversity, equity and inclusion practice and policies. So perhaps you could share your thoughts, Farah.
Well, we have a cultural moment, don't we, emanating from the Oval Office and associated. But I mean, that backlash is also, it doesn't just begin in that moment. That I think that, you know, from the moments of suffrage, there's been a backlash, and Bettina and Kay will be able to testify to that. So, you know, we're talking about equity and equalization. We're not talking about the supremacy of women or an Amazonian culture. So to be colourful about it. So obviously there needs to be a vigorous defence of these policies and explanations to people. I think that sometimes missing in these public policy conversations is quite an esoteric kind of debate, but not sort of a simple language explanation. This is about actually ensuring that the migrant family resident in Wyndham gets when they go to the local health service. There's some appropriate language or culturally appropriate service response. That's fair. It actually speaks to our self-image as Australians, even if we don't realize it, our egalitarianism, etc. So I think that it requires also a degree of political courage. I mean, both Bettina and Kay have talked about actually the change happens when you implement it, and you can't wait for you. So you need leadership. And hopefully that'll be more female leadership and female diverse leadership that actually realizes that point, which I think is a really cogent point. So yes, we are having that moment, which is sort of magnified by the crazy social media age in which we live. But I think we have to maintain, we don't have to be defensive about it. We have to defend it and value it and cherish it. I actually want to use the word cherish because it's about moving from the denial of rights to the flowering of rights, and it's about fairness. It's about being Australian. At the risk of sounding like someone on a soapbox, I hope that's a sufficient response. I'll be joining. I urge everyone who obviously feels strongly about women's issues to have those kitchen table conversations and cherish the advances that we've made and the advances we need to make in the future. And it's not like we have affirmative action rallying through our institutions at this moment in time either. It's quite, we're not living in the Nordic states or social. It's actually very modest, the kind of inclusive practices and policies we have in place in our workplaces and such. We need more rigorous policy making at the top and at the bottom table. And I want to acknowledge that point about the community, because change doesn't just happen in Canberra. It happens in communities, and we're actually seeing more opportunities for change in communities, including in council areas. Exciting change and exciting ideas coming from direct contact with people and their experiences that belie the sort of arid policy terrain of Canberra. Though I lived in Canberra and I love it, and I love public servants too. My sister is one. So I don't decry them. They're very important in part of implementing change. So yeah, that's my response.
There's another question here which maybe Bettina would like to answer. What are the panel's thoughts about the impact on women of Peter Dutton's announcement that he would force all public servants back into the office?
I'm happy to answer that. Firstly, and I think it fits with what I'm going to say in answer to that question, Farah's point about why we are in our public policy in this regard pretty unique also means that we're not America. We do not have USA public policy with respect to these issues. So when the notion that because diversity, equity, inclusion programs might be under threat in the US, although don't forget the checks and balances in that country and the fact that many firms, from my reading, are pushing back against that. We need to say that we have developed these policies of equity and inclusion over the long haul. They are part of the unique nature of Australia's liberal democracy and our push towards equal economic participation for women and men. I would therefore say that following on from that, the flexible work patterns that have been developing over a long period, and especially during the pandemic, when if there were not the possibility of flexible work practices for working from home, our school children would have had no education. I have a granddaughter who teaches, that's how old I am, highest level maths to HSC students right through that period, more than 2 years. She taught her students online so that they could continue their education. We are dealing with public servants of all stripes, teachers. Nurses can't. There's hands-on stuff you can't do sitting in your living room table with a screen like we are. But there is so much that can be done flexibly through working from home that it would diminish the role of the marvellous Australian public service. We have much to be proud of in the Australian public service. And the fact that it's been able to develop flexible work practices, given a very big push through the pandemic, is something I believe we should cherish. I think it's your word, Farah, we should cherish. It's not only people with children, it's people with other caring responsibilities, people caring for a disabled offspring who might be 50 and their mother usually is still caring for them and still able to get some income into the household. People, women with disability who are able to work, able to be employed for money because they're able to work remotely. This is, I think, should be placed in great Australian treasures, you know, some of the incredibly important developments that have been enshrined in Australian employment policy. That would be my answer.
Thanks, Bettina. You might like to respond to this one too, Kay, to that previous question, but there's a fantastic question which I'll put to you first, Kay, and then others might want to respond. What's the number one action you recommend I tell my 16 and 13-year-old daughters to think about doing as the next generation needing to continue the ongoing work to protect rights? Number one action. It's a hard one.
It is. It's big, and it's where you want to take that one. It would be that for me, it's that pushback against this constant individualization, that it's keeping in mind that communal, the civic responsibilities, the sharing of this, the care load of not accepting this curtailments on their opportunities because of these social expectations around how things are always done. I think part of I'm just going to go to all the previous questions. I think part of this pushback against the DEI policies is we're really on the cusp of this. Like, these are modern institutions that we've built where we treated everyone the same, and we had these big cookie cutter blocks of policies that we rolled out to populations. And that's coming undone as people, where this period of this individualized sort of postmodern sort of people can be who they want, they can be in the world how they want, and our institutions haven't kept up with that. And so child support's a really good case in point, where families no longer look anything like how they were imagined when the child support policy came in. So it's a really difficult time to navigate, especially as a sort of a young person entering adulthood, and there's a lot of these, the machinery of our social life is still quite antiquated. Like, the school system it doesn't fit with this whole work, care, life balance. It's very rigid in how it works, and life is changing. And so it's for women and men, and I'd say it's equally for men to start, that's probably a better answer, start these conversations around it's not just women's responsibility to make all of this work. It's bringing men into the conversation to see the advantages and the richness of life and this engagement with social life that comes through care often, and how that can be shared. And there's studies from Melbourne University showing that in school age, boys really want this richer life. They don't want to just go and be sort of the company man or go straight into work and never see their family. They're wanting these connections, but it's at the point of childbearing and employment and the financial pressure that comes with that exacerbates and locks everyone into these roles that neither women nor men wanted. And how we can intervene in that earlier for young people to demand the social institutions and the social machinery that lets them work the way, work and care and live. And I'd add social care or self-care is another important thing that people can do when working remotely, that's the completely invisible thing that the sort of neoliberalization has meant that we can't, unless we're being endlessly productive, we're doing something wrong. No, working remotely lets us just pause and rest and look after ourselves. And that we need to embed from the beginning. So young people and young women should be putting these kinds of sharing and caring into the heart of the conversation and bringing their peers along with them.
Thanks, Kay. And I was actually tempted to change that question to say, what should I say to my young sons? Because all too often we're putting the responsibility of change on women when men need to step up too. We've got 6 more minutes. There is a very compelling comment in the chat which highlights much of what you've talked about, I think, Bettina, particularly around the really difficult circumstance of older women who are overlooked, particularly those in private rental and on relying on the age pension. So if there was one thing that you could think about, what needs to be done for older women to improve their circumstance?
I'm going to go quickly back to the Grattan report of a month or so ago, which looked at the poverty of older private renters, private rental. And there's a section there in the report, which, only a small section, but I love the Grattan Institute, which looked at the fact that women are overrepresented as low-income older renters. And of course, these are women mainly on pension who haven't been age pension as they should be, who haven't been able to accumulate any savings. And the Grattan Institute calls for an increase in rent assistance. Well, that's really so important. It's a no-brainer. It's an immediate amelioration of terrible circumstances. But why aren't we bolder? Why aren't we going back to the key importance of a building up and investing in our social housing sector? How important not just to have for older people, older women who've had and will continue, many disadvantaged women to have no chance to accumulate private savings through interrupted labour force participation, interrupted by lots of care, Kay's point, care of children and care of other family members, to be in owner-occupied housing. We still make owner-occupied housing the light on the hill. I understand that. We all had our big chance at that. But Australia once had an enshrinement of, albeit residual, social housing. And social housing means not just affordability. It can mean well-built housing, appropriate housing, housing in good locations, accessible housing, accessible to community and shopping and healthcare. I would go for that very, very strongly. I know it's longer term and increase in rent assistance is crucial in the short term, but somebody has to start talking about the importance of this. Current government has a big housing fund by which they hope to invest in social housing, but sorry, this doesn't sound very academically professional, but we need it now. We need the emphasis on it now.
Can I add, as someone who worked for the Tenants Union of the Tenants Victoria for 5 years, which began during the pandemic period, I heartily endorse that. I've spoken to so many women over 55, including those from diverse backgrounds, that have suddenly found themselves in a situation where they have to go to look for share housing, which is not a position they'd ever conceived. Many of these have been working women, working in in the caring economy, notably. A number of them that I spoke, working in retail, have always had jobs, but have found themselves in an extraordinary position of having to look for share housing alongside, and then having to sort of test their core residents and not feeling safe in that housing. So it is such a core issue. As a point of comparison, I think the UK, for all its ills, has some close to 17-18% of people who rent in social housing. So and of course other European models far more. We have significantly underinvested in that area, and women are paying a high price for that. So bravo, Bettina. I found all the facts you've fed us very inspiring. But to keep working at change.
And
Thank you.
Very short comment from you, Kay, to round out the discussion.
You're always loving me these. I think we all, as someone said earlier, we know what all the issues are. We know what all the solutions are. It's the political will and the cultural change. And I think Farah said earlier about who needs to be at the table, and the power of people with lived experience of these issues, who are the real experts in what is wrong and what needs to change. Advocacy organisations who can carry those messages with them, researchers and academics supporting that with the stats and the contextualising some of these experiences to make them beyond sort of the case study, and then the public service and the politicians that are listening at the moment. I think there's a great opportunity to bring all of these different viewpoints together to really get the messages that need to be heard by the people that need to hear them. It's been really powerful in the consultations we run, and often the public service come. They're moved and changed by what they see on the ground, and it's really powerful, and we have to keep doing that.
Thank you. And we've come to an end. I think one of the comments here, which I really like, and it's certainly done it for me, they say, "Thank you so much. This has refilled my cup and rekindled my fire for the slow wheels of change." So I hope this discussion has done that for everyone, as it has done for me. And thank you so much for your generosity in sharing your thoughts.